There's coffee and stuff just outside, and the toilets are out the door immediately to your right. But there's also on the other floors in the same place, there are different sets of toilets. And lunch, but it's still a long way off, will be one floor down. But let me, without any further comments, introduce our first and our keynote speaker, Dr. Musi Maimani. He grew up in Soweto, and I think that's where he got his passion for the inclusion and upliftment of the poor and the excluded and the marginalized. And that has been that, together with youth leadership and other kinds of leadership, have been his passion for many years. And I've seen that in his life. He's, of course, very well known now for being a member of parliament. And in that capacity, he really needs to rush off with screeching tires once he's done here to open a parliamentary event at 10 o'clock. So we'll give him the grace and not keep him here. But while we have him, we're going to really soak up every word, and there will be a few minutes for questions. He also very recently, I think it was on Monday that the degree was actually conferred, got his doctorate. And us in tertiary education, we know what that is about. Those of us who have completed that journey, we carry the scars, and some of us are still struggling. So, congratulations, a very hearty congratulations. And now I give over to the man who got us all out of bed before the crack of dawn. We're so looking forward, Musi. Thank you.
Let me do this. Sanborani Dumelang Molweni, good morning. And thank you so much for having me, Marianne. It's a great honor and a privilege to really be able to speak to you this morning. Um, I am conscious of the fact that there is a psychological difference between people from Joburg and people from Cape Town. An 8:30 start in Cape Town is near lunchtime. I mean, in Joburg is like lunchtime already. People already have done 4 or 5 hours of work. In Cape Town, it's like people don't even believe Jesus is awake at 8:30. It's just it is it is asking a lot of people. So your sacrifices are well noted. I want to affirm you for having made it through here. I as a good Joburger, I'd already been to the gym by 5 o'clock this morning. So let's see how well we keep up. I wanted to be here for most of the day, but I'm not. The debate this morning is really about the budget process and the appropriations bill, which has been voted on in Parliament today. And so I was saying I am the opening batsman because now the bill is my bill to put forward. Because if you know about parliamentary processes, the Minister of Finance proposes the budget, it ends up with me, and I have the job to get it through Parliament so it becomes law, so that on the 1st of August, you have policemen, healthcare, and all of that. So you have a choice. You can keep me here all day or have no police, doctors, anything working on the 1st of August, because if we don't get this first bit right, every expenditure cuts down to 10% on the 1st of August. And so at 10%, I think you might not be in the 10% of the police stations we need. So good luck. So I'm going to try and get there today, but also come through. I got the topic today to say we are here to speak about leadership and innovation. And indeed, to be able to speak at Cornerstone is a great honor, certainly post having graduated at the University of Johannesburg, to come here to an institution to speak so passionate about what education has done for me and to speak about what it does for our own leadership is indeed a great privilege. I don't need to bore you with the platitudes to say, as President Mandela said, that education does in fact restore the dignity of humanity. I reflect on that journey at a personal level because many people just know some of the public bio. But sometimes you forget to acknowledge the fact that as a child of a cashier. My mother never got an opportunity to finish high school, and a father who worked in a factory. To be able to stand here before you with a PhD is not only a tribute to who they are as people who were willing to pay the sacrifices, but it's the community with which forms so much. And now, today, in a generation, I tell my kids now that I've got a PhD, you guys can't just finish halfway through. So, best you get going. And my kids looked at me, and like most people, with great cynicism and wonder, I'm hoping that with a PhD, my wife will take me a little bit more seriously, but it's still a long way off. But the work that institutions like Cornerstone does do that profound and important work of dealing with the dignity of humanity. It gives color to people in a world, it gives people's ability to see color in a world that is otherwise people would feel colorblind. The dignity that education bestows upon one also gives one great responsibility to say, how do you use what you've been given to be able to impact society even more so? And so today, when we begin to look at what innovation and leadership looks like, I felt it'd be crucial to pay tribute to institutions of learning because they are significant in being able to, like me, take a first generation impact through education and set up the next generation for something better than what their parents could ever have. I joined public life because, in truth, I genuinely believed that everything that we do is spiritual. Everything that we do has an ability to be changed, and leadership, in fact, must be able to change and impact all aspects of society. I never for once thought to myself I'd end up in parliament. But then I thought, like a young South African, I started off in church. I then got involved in business. I was doing a bit of psychology. And then the bite of politics got in touch with me and then did many other things. But in all of those areas, I never felt a sense of fragmentation because you are who you are. And if you hold a vision for all of those things, you can appreciate how all of them can bring a societal impact. I say that to you because I think it's always crucial. People think that their contribution to society is insignificant. It's only people in these areas or that area that can make a difference. But I would argue that each one of us have been placed somewhere for such a time as this to make an impact to our society. We're trying to not solve for our own little corner. We are also saying from our corner, how do we become us and me for all of us? And what I wanted to theme today is that you cannot look at innovation until you are willing to understand the grand impact of the small pebble of contribution that you make across all of society. So, to do that, I speak proudly as a South African and a South African who's journeying every day, having been in all of these sectors, be it church, be it politics, being business, being all of them. I want to invite you to say our nation needs almost all hands on deck at a moment such as this one. The context, your innovation, or any sense of impact you can have as a leader operates in a country such as ours. And I think we sometimes forget because, sometimes I live in my own little world. I am a husband of one wife. I have 3 children, and that becomes my world. And that's all important. But I think sometimes if I look next door and I look at my neighbor and I look at the broad status of our country, I want to say to you, as fellow South Africans, people in education, because eventually, as soon as you graduate, I will invite you to say, what difference are you making in society with what you've been given? We're living in a country where young people in this country, 2 out of 3 young people, cannot find employment. The narrow definition of unemployment in this country puts us at 35%. If I was to aggregate all of these in provinces, you can get to a province like Limpopo, where you begin to lose the broad definition of unemployment that gets closer to 50%. Let's put some things in context. 11 million South Africans are not in employment, they are not in education, they are not in training. These are young people. The majority of people, 90% of those who are unemployed, generally have a matric or less than. So yes, I know many people said graduates are unemployed. I get that. There are unemployed doctors, there are unemployed teachers, there's all of that. I do accept that point. But at least I know one thing. A person who drops out of school has got a far more significant chance of ending up being unemployed than a person with a higher degree. It also, in many ways, tells me of a society upon which when a person is unemployed up to the age of 29, the probability of them working for the rest of their lives becomes almost minimal. So once people are unemployed, they become progressively unemployable. So the tension that we're facing, I want to impress upon you the urgency of the moment. Because if you don't appreciate that, we run the risk of just saying, it's just, let me figure out what's happening just in my own little world. But we're living in a very complicated country. We live in a country where more than half the citizens in this country are living below the upper poverty line. So, yes, you and I, I drive my car, I live in a great home, I get to fly, all sorts of things. But that's not the reality for more than half the citizens in this country. It puts a situation where when you reflect on the extent of poverty and you arrive in the Eastern Cape and you meet a mother who says, all I'm doing is boiling the last lot of leaves before potentially I take my life or take the lives of my kids, do you appreciate that poverty in this country is quite a significant challenge? I don't have to bore you with this, but in truth, we are also living in a fairly dangerous country. 65 South Africans are being murdered every single day. The probability of conviction for murder is 1 in 5. So our society is not safe. As you would have picked up yesterday in the news, you would have seen quite clearly that citizens are also getting frustrated. They're frustrated with crime not being solved. For every child and every mother or any child who gets killed, whether by the mother or someone in the community eventually takes up arms, ends up on the streets and says, we need better answers than this. And so as our society is fast becoming more and more violent, it also means society is becoming unstable. All of us are tired of the fact that when we read the news, it feels like who's next to be corrupt? Why have we lost track of the sense of ethical leadership and an ethical and a capable state? So we look in our country and we say, help us, because now we're grappling with all reports of corruption, all reports of challenges. And as all of that takes place, it gives opportunism where people can feel our society is fragmented. It is fast becoming racially divided. And more than anything, we're seeing a rise of tribalism and culture wars. Today, never than before, I am in a mixed marriage, or I never know what the right term for that. And, when I got my doctorate, a friend of mine said, "Sure, it's so nice that you have a doctorate and you are married to a professor." I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Your wife is always in charge and she will tell you what to do." And it generally is true. But I fear her because she's half Welsh and half Lebanese. And if you know anything about Lebanese, then you know that I live in fear generally. So, in that, when we first got married, we could feel the tensions. People were like, this is not right. And now I'm watching our kids who are mixed race engage in society. But as we walk around, I can see there's now a new political rise that seems to want to suggest that maybe integration of different races isn't what we're about. I hear political leaders now start to use language like we must unite black people and we must unite this. Or I hear political parties say we will go to the United States to speak on behalf of this race or that race. And then I hear the resurrection of songs that come through a racially divided society. So if that doesn't get you depressed, here's what I hoped it would do by laying it all before you, is that a bit like there are two types of businessmen who arrived in Africa. There are some who look at Africa and they say, look, people don't have shoes, they don't have cars, they don't have roads, a shame. And then there are others who come to this great continent and say, the people don't have shoes, they don't have cars, what an opportunity. Which of those two will you be is then the question of whether you will strive to say, how do we find the most apt solutions for our country? Because then you can walk around and say, I see that there are young people without education, or they are without a health care, or they're without this. What can we do rather than our shame? I'm hoping to invite you to a leadership that is activist in nature. Because I wish someone had bothered enough often in my life to sit me down and say, to whom much is given, actually much is expected. And that you have a duty to this country. I could come and be nice, tell you all theory about leadership. But I want to invite you to say there's a moment in our country that is asking for you, asking for leadership that is impactful, asking for leadership that will ask the tough questions. We're engaged right now with, as part of our foundation, with a program that is using artificial intelligence to say, how do we streamline young people so that they can, at grade 10, be able to aptly choose which subjects they want to do, get to matric, get subject help that they will help them pick their careers, and ultimately by the time they're not picking bursaries or finding things, they're not just choosing one because it's available, but they're choosing one because it's passion. But it took a young South African, Skalkberg, you can decide what race he is on the basis of that, who said, it is not enough for me to just look after just a few, but what I would want to do is work with as many South Africans across to democratize access to the type of intelligence that helps guide careers. That, for me, sits at the heart of innovation, but it isn't innovation for the sense of profit making. It is innovation to solve inherently a very important societal challenge. It was the innovation I saw in a number of doctors I worked with in Alexandra, who during COVID said to themselves, how can we use virtual platforms to allow for patients to be able to have an online consult so that we can give them the appropriate medication, the appropriate knowledge, so that we could build healthier societies. These are South Africans who are saying, how do we innovate? It's an innovation that I found with a young South African who said, I'm going to create a digital app that lets people be able to say, at the click of a button, we will Uberize security response in our community, so much so that all the private security guard, the police, and all of them are linked into one app that when you click on it and you feel you are in danger, the person with the closest car of response to you responds immediately, and therefore you are able to feel a sense of safety in that community. If you want to talk about innovation, sure, we can talk about AI, we can talk about all of them, but I am asking you inherently, look out the window, see the challenges of our nation, rise up to it, and say, what can we do to be able to impact not some, but the majority of our citizens? These are just a few examples I was able to interact with of people who are saying, for us, innovation is about figuring out the best ways to lead through these very turbulent times. We want to make an impact in our communities by saying to ourselves, as we democratize access to whatever it is, whether it be to healthcare, to education, to safety, we, the few South Africans, are able to take this moment and do something about what needs to happen in our communities. And the stories are endless. I see them daily, bright young South Africans who are saying to me, we found this innovative way of literally inspiring people to participate in public processes. In simple terms, they make it digitally available for people to be able to respond to key legislation, etc. They're not thinking it's just about me. They're thinking, if indeed I've been placed on this earth for such a time as this, how do I use the little bit that I can to be able to impact society? You will never be able to innovate and as a leader unless you've got two things that drive you. The first is a sense of values, and the second is a sense of diversity. And let me start perhaps maybe with the easiest. Why do I stress diversity? Because diversity gives you an ability to interact with people who see the world different to you. And when people can challenge your view in the clash and the tension of ideas, it is there post facto that we find the best solutions for our society. I've also lived in times where people just simply cannot think in a diverse context. I mean, many of you have seen the very faux pas of adverts that have you've watched on TV and said, wasn't there a woman in the room who would have told them that that doesn't work? I've seen it in public policy. I'll never forget the city of Johannesburg. When we were there was a problem in Alexandra with a rat infestation, right? So the clever people in the city thought to themselves, you know what would solve this problem is if we deploy owls. Now, if you've never sat with black people, you'll at least figure out quite quickly that black people and owls are not in the same WhatsApp group. So the rats didn't die first, but I can assure you there are no owls in Alexandra. So those are about how you say, fine, even in implementation, talk to people broader than you. Hear their stories. Hear the sense of challenging in your own thinking. President Kalama Motlanthe once said to me, he said, when you pursue leadership, you pursue it because at some level you doubted others. Allow others to doubt you. So, you need a sense of diversity, but the second is you need values. And the one value I'd highlight is the idea of Ubuntu, something we all share in common. I know some of us are Christians, some of us might not. In some ways, the value of Ubuntu says, I see you're a human being. I happen to think that part of God's restorative plan is to restore our humanity. Otherwise, we'd all be like, and our humanity says, I see that we share common humanity, but it also says, I see that we share common threats. When climate changes, of course, it affects all of us. When a snake comes in here, it affects all of us. So we share common threats, whatever that threat is. And we need to bring out some of that translation of values. Values are what gives us conviction. Values in our societies that work well together. Think about Scandinavian countries. They do so because they are organized around a set of values. It's what people like Soren Kierkegaard put into Scandinavian nations to say, let us have this idea of building, the German word for another way of saying Ubuntu, what organizes us. The Zulu word sawubona is not just a greeting that's colloquial. It's a way of saying, ngiyakubona, I see that you are a human being. We share common humanity. And were we to hold on to that, what is then important is that it would add insult to the fact that if I'm eating and you are not eating, something is not right. I say that because when we've lost values in society, we create societies with profound inequality where we fail to realize that it is not good for us just to simply be consumers when so many are living below the upper poverty line. That it is not good for us to provide an education for some that is at world class and others will struggle. I see Dr. Volmink is here, so I better be careful what I say about education, otherwise I can't. But that is, those in essence speak to the core of a society that must be organized around values. And I would argue the sooner we understand what makes us who we are, we will be quick to, when we look at our public leaders, to say to ourselves, those who undermine our values ought not to be leading us. But secondly, leadership is always about vision. It is always about adding economic value to people. It must insult all of us, the levels of unemployment. It must insult all of us to say that our nation is kind of in some ways muddling our way forward. We best find a way to say, how do we create that vision that translates? Because we cannot enter this plane called South Africa and be unclear about what our destination is. If we fail to know what our destination must be, we will be led by turbulence, not by vision. And so whatever headwinds hit our way will continue to direct us in different directions. See, if we can get that, there's a beautiful book, and I'd encourage you to read it. I'll remember the author in a moment, called Pride and Shame, The Rise of the Right in the US. And what the author argues for is that these axes of pride and shame, our society, when societies feel a sense of shame, they look for these dominant leadership types that they want to vote for because they say, here's someone who's gone through shame, they will fight for me. But for you and I, it's why I'm such a fan of education. Because if society goes through deepening levels of shame, they leave themselves in a space where you can't say to them, you don't know who they will elect, because now they will look for whoever will fight for them. And for those of us who have maybe achieved education or whatever, I always like to wake up in the morning and think to myself, can I bring pride to my community? Because that makes it possible for a young person to believe that this nation can be great. And like as I close, I ask you to be involved, be active, be activists. You've heard the cliche, evil triumphs when good people do nothing. When you and I fail, society fails. When we fail our families, our society is impacted. When we fail in public leadership, our society is impacted. And so I want to ask you today to, rather than let us sit and invite people to belong just here, I would urge you to take the time to say, how do you participate in processes of our country? In being able to go to your local council and say, when there's an issue, how can I get involved? Go to your local school and say, how can I serve in this way, in one way or another? As a young South African, and I close with this, and I'm happy to take any questions. 2 South Africans during apartheid took time to come to Soweto and say, can we teach kids maths and science? Alec and Linda Galanakis took the time. They, like anyone else, they came, they said, we want to be activists. You wouldn't read about them in the history of our country and say these were, but for me, in their little way, they took the time to say, we will find this young kid, we will help them, we will use the little bit that we have. And ultimately, they taught me math, science, and English in a home where my mother only spoke Xhosa and my father only spoke Tswana. And through that combination, they brought the sort of conviction to say, wait, hang on, I don't need to live in fear, I can be empowered to make a difference. They took their small sense of activism, and I wouldn't be able to have stood here today had it not been for their contribution. I guess my question to you, being in a privileged position of being able to gain access to education in a country that desperately needs your hands and feet, what activism, what difference will you make? And if I leave you with anything, sure, you have the job to lead, you have values to transmit, you hopefully have a vision for where this country can go. I hope you do not stop at that, or it can become self-gratifying, but to wake up every day and say, in my street, in my community, what difference can I make? Let's be impactful as leaders. I thank you very much.
Sure, Dr. Maimani, you've touched on so many points close to my heart and close to Cornerstone's heart. The floor is now open for questions and comments. Please, even if you don't have a question, please feel free to comment. There are roaming mics. Just put up your hand so that we can all hear the question or the comment. And we've got about 10 minutes for that. Please make use of the opportunity.
Still too early. This is Cape Town.
I'm Martin. Uh, Dr. Maimani, I just want to know, I want to use the opportunity of having you here as a seasoned politician. And my question really is about how, as you have already said, a country where people follow popularism and the one who shout the loudest, especially in the context of politics, how do you do really influence the young people not to be swayed by political agendas, but what you have said, but value-driven leadership? How do you inspire them that they see beyond rhetorics to real issues and to fight for real issues, not for popularism?
Okay. Maybe we should take 2 or 3 and then we might have another round because if you have one-on-one, then would that work? I think that'd be easier. Just take 2 or 3. So let's go to the next question. I saw there was a hand here and then I saw another one here.
Greetings, Dr. Maimani. My name is Nzoma Doda. I heard you talk about innovation, but my question is, how to become innovative when you do not know my problem?
When you do not?
When you don't know my problem. For instance, you can go to psychology, it's Eurocentric, but we're in Africa. Everything is said in a way that those who are not Africans will understand. Can make an example. Our children went to the white schools, they are taught to look at the eyes of the teacher. While when I grew up, I was taught not to look at the eyes of my parents. You can listen, we just had a case of JP Benenge now. You will see that the language was a problem because JP Benenge once said abantwana, meaning children in English. But in real cause, that's not abantwana as children, as kids. So my question is, how do I become innovative to other races that I do not understand where they are coming from? How do I solve like the issue that you have just said of the O's? I will kill them even myself. I don't have dogs in my house. The dogs sit outside. Other people, the dogs sit inside. So you know this story of dogs and cats and everything. So how do you become innovative with all these things that we are so different, yet we are staunch in our beliefs about them? I don't understand why a dog must be sitting in the car instead of at the back of the car, but some other people do understand and they practice that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to say to you, some others, it will be seen as if someone is having a dog in his car, he is there's apartheid. But while that is not. So I'm trying to bring this to you so that
Sure. I mean, we'll take a vote on the temperature in the room. That'll give you a sense of diversity. Others are in the 80 blow section and other people are still in the Nkosi Sikeleli sections. But we'll get through. I think, Louise, you had a did you have your hand up? Are you all covered? Let me take one last one and then maybe other people might. All covered? Oh, there's one at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wasn't actually going to ask, but I just want to hone in just what he said about the diversity. And firstly, thank you very much for coming out here and also for the humanness that you portrayed in your speech and not just coming from a political, canvassing point of view. So I just wanted to, speak about what he pointed out as a diversity. And we need to be obviously aware of, from a political point of view and a governance point of view, that the complexity of South Africa in terms of diversity does make it difficult, to address certain issues. And I think it is something that we need to emphasize from my point of view, not to really distinctly address certain issues that really make some of the culture superior, because when we speak about diversity, we speak about cultures. So, in that respect, what is the point of view for governance to address the social ills that we are currently sitting with? That's the first question. But I've got other questions. I wanted to zone into your theological background, but for another time, maybe, if we don't have chance now.
Let,
Someone else, then I'll
all right.
come back if we have time. Thank you.
Let me start with the first question. And I think the book I referenced about shame and pride is a very important dynamic, because in many ways it also asks the questions about economics. I think populism rises in society when there's, in some ways, people are feeling economically marginalized. And you can go to many communities. I think it should be offensive in this country that political leaders can hold rallies in the middle of the week and people show up. It says that you are campaigning to people who are living unemployed. It also, just when I give you the budget figures, let me just give you, in South Africa, for every 1 rand that is put in the fiscus, right, 22 cents of it goes towards debt repayment or debt servicing costs. About 38 cents of it goes to the payment of the bureaucracy. So that kind of is like the employment of civil servants, teachers, etc. And then just over 60 cents of it, and I know you might say your mathematics a bit wonky, of course, over 60 cents of it goes towards the social wage, and that's grants, etc., etc. So that's what we spend our money on. You say, well, it goes beyond 1 rand because we have to borrow the balance to balance the figures, if I could. So South Africa every year is borrowing more and spending. The state is an employment agent. If you think about 90% of the budget being either keeping people in the civil service or keeping them at home through a grant. So that's the work that we're doing. So our conditions are such that you can campaign by threatening people that you will withdraw their grants rather than coming up with ideas. And so when you ask the question, how do we revert back to making sure that we don't have populists being elected? Let me give you perhaps maybe just this one thought, and there can be many thoughts on this issue. But I would argue apartheid government lost its legitimacy when it started to spend more on the education on black children than it was historically doing. When you begin to educate your society, you force them to challenge questions. So in some ways, and I'm not suggesting that there's wisdom in this, I'm merely indicating the fact that our ability to educate our citizens lies at the core of making sure that there's a genuine confrontation with what is going on, and then not an easy deception into the hands of populists. The second, I would argue, is that it's a leadership that is willing to talk about difficult things. The definition about strongman politics is that they have easy answers to complex problems. The difficulty about smart people or people who are more in the middle, centrist, rational, whatever, is that they find complicated solutions to simple problems, to simple questions. And here's what I mean. I'll take a simple one. Immigration. Right? That's a global problem. Your populists stand up and they say, lock them up, or build a wall and ask them to pay for it. Right? It's a fairly simple response to a very complicated question. Now, people say, well, you can't really say that. I say, come with me to Germany. I was in Germany and I was speaking to a number of, in a community meeting. And I said to them, have you spoken to what people are saying? And when you speak to German women, now German women are dressed up, they're normally dressed very liberally, let me put it that way. You've got a lot of young Turkish immigrants who have arrived in Germany, right? They come into Germany, these are young Muslim men who are not used to seeing women dressed up like that. So, of course, when the women are walking around the streets, this is like Christmas to these Turkish young men, right? So they're like looking around all animated by this. How do the German women feel? They go, in this town, they feel, we're feeling ogled at. So they come to their political representatives and said, these Turks are ogling us. That's how they say it. The clever people say, well, you mustn't be so xenophobic. This is a very, very sensitive issue. We've got immigration laws. And so they come up with complex responses to a simple, I don't like being ogled by men. Then they go to another political party, which is a far-right party in Germany. They arrive and they say, we feel ogled. And then that leadership then says to them, no, we will kick them out. Who do you think those people are going to vote for? And if you look at the German results recently, they'll tell you who they voted for. So all I'm saying to you is that rational people must talk about difficult things. Shying away from an issue like immigration, like whatever, isn't going to help us. Whatever it is, we are living in a complicated world where we have to be able to show citizens that we hear them, because the political brain isn't the intellectual brain, it is a very emotional brain. And so I'm inviting you, sir, wherever the community is. I mean, if I did a survey here and said, how many of you just discussed the politics of this country around the dinner table? I'd argue the case that there aren't enough in our country who are doing that. I almost force my kids every day to watch the news until there's a case where I have to have a social media expert describing what a peeled banana means, which I still don't know. But I force my kids to watch the news almost every single day because I've got to conscientize them about what is going on in our society. Mhlekazwam, you ask an important question about the intersect between culture and diversity. Your point is well made. But here's my argument, is that what South Africa desperately needs is the points that are strong to be made on both sides. Because of course, there are some cultural issues that are at odds with some of our constitution. There are some cultural practices that violate the rights of women, for argument's sake. And therefore, there must be a conversation about that. What I would invite you to say, rather, and this is the point I was trying to leave you with, that actually, if you're seeking innovation, it's at the intersect between when those values and leaders are willing to sit in a room and hear each other out. I am not of the school of thought when people arrive and they say we want to something, decolonize, do this, do that. I don't sit there. I'd rather be constructivist in my view that say, how do we build what responds to South Africa? Because whether you and I accept that point or not, South Africa will always be a nation that is reflective of the many diversities. Even if they are not across racial lines, they can be across cultural lines, tribal lines. So we need to sit down and argue the point. Because when we can have a dialogue and have the humility to say, I'm willing to hear you, I think what emerges at the end of that is better. It is better for innovation. It is better for our future, because then we can be able to understand each other. When it comes to, and Professor Volmink will talk about curriculum design and many other issues in education, of course, we've got to be able to make submissions. And all of us come out with the best values going forward. But I would say it only can occur in dialogue when we're willing to hear each other out. And so that you can define to me what you mean by X, I can define to you what you mean by Y. Because I kind of take Nelson Mandela's school of thought. Human beings are inherently good. Hear them out. Before I label them by their race, their gender, their this and that, I must hear them out. And allow people. If you've ever learned a different language, I travel enough times. If you've ever tried to learn a language, there is a point upon which you must appreciate that you are going to make a fool of yourself. Allow yourself to ask other people to let you be foolish. You learn better. Let me close by the last question. I know I'm being kicked. I'm being kicked out now. Yes. You raised this point, and I think that's the point I was trying to make about diversity. You know, I mean, when I led in a church, you hinted at my theology. When I led in a church, this debate about theology or about diversity would come in. What songs do you sing? What do you believe about certain things, you know? How do you respond to certain? I mean, I remember my first ever. I had to give a theological account of what I mean by lobola, whether it's found in the Bible or not. All of these issues about sexuality, all of that. The one ability we should never lose is the humility to hear each other. People like Richard Rohr write so aptly about stages of consciousness. And maybe the first phase of consciousness is I'm a tribalist, and therefore I must define my tribe as to those who agree with me on everything and oppose those who disagree with me on everything. The higher you go and the more humble you become, I would argue you become a bit like Jesus. You find yourself in a space where you say, I'm willing to hear from those who don't agree with me, those who are not holy like me. And then you kneel by the side of the road and hear them out. And I think you get a better position than if you just simply say, I'm here to prepare just for my tribe. Because I think what heals society, what heals racism, what heals sexism, what heals any type of discrimination is when you are willing to sit with the people who are other to you and see their humanity and see the divine in them. Because as Archbishop Tutu says, is that actually when you see a human being, you see the image of God. So regardless of how it presents itself, you will eventually sit with that person and be able to be enriched, because then we will share something more powerfully. So I am an advocate of diversity because I think no human is born complete. We need one another to grow and be more human, more. That's why you need your parents to help you walk. That's why we need our community to help us be who we are. And if you've heard me say anything today, and I'll leave you with these words, please let us ease up on the tribalism and my own preferences. Let us practice an orthodoxy of generosity that invites us to look outside and see that. As I was driving here, I drive past Century City, which is LSM, the highest LSM possible with the most amount of money. And then within 5 minutes, I'm in a shack community. If I could find a way for those two people to have a discussion, I wonder where this nation could be. Duckheads.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maimani. This is for you to remember us by. And Fabian will relieve you of the headset, and Rion will walk you to your car, but don't keep him, he's in a hurry. And we just thank you so much for your time. It's really precious to us. Thank you. Louise, you can come and prepare so long. And now we welcome Dr. Louise van Rijn, who is a master practitioner in leadership and organizational development, a social change activist, and the founder of Symphonia. She is the visionary behind Partners for Possibility, a globally acclaimed initiative that has strengthened thousands of leaders while advancing collaborative social impact in South Africa's education system. So already she's speaking our language, and she's going to talk to us about the self as instrument in the
Thank you
leadership
very much.
context.
Thank you. So, one of the things that I hate about these kind of conferences, and I go to lots of them, is the fact that we are kind of, a group of people. I'm standing at the top, you all sitting down looking at me. Because the real value from this session is going to come if we have conversations with each other. So, my hope is that you will speak up when you want to comment, respond, because that's going to be much more interesting than me standing here talking at you. I have a practice of reflection where whenever I go to a session, and I think about what worked for me in this session, and the things that irritate me is when I feel that I have, that I want to participate and I want to say something and then I can't. So I had to think long and hard about how do I do this session today in a way that will feel in integrity with what matters to me. And I decided I'm going to share some stories because most of the time when we have these conversations and I tell a story, something shifts in the room. The first story is something that happened yesterday. I was on LinkedIn, and a colleague of mine who worked with me in the UK shared a a little story about something that happened 25 years ago. Here's what he said. He said, I was thinking, this is my friend Tim Conley. He said, I was thinking about the time that Mark and I, so they were the founders of the organization that I joined 25 years ago. Mark and I went away for a couple of days strategizing, and I mentioned that I had brought along a fiery South African red wine to lubricate our thinking. Mark said, I think we've just hired one of those. Fiery red South African. So that was a big kind of aha moment for me because I thought, oh my word. In a way, that story represents what I've learned about self as instrument. So 25 years ago, I was one of the most self-assured, knowing, had all the answers, expert that you could imagine. And I went into the world with a lot of certainty and enthusiasm and passion for what I was doing. Until one day, I had a real reminder of how that lands when leaders show up with so much confidence and uncertainty. But before I tell that story, let me just ask a question around that will have a little go at the men in the room. Because women are allowed to have a go at the men every now and again. Is that true? Would you agree? I think we have. So if you had to go to a pub in London and there are a whole bunch of men sitting around drinking beer, how will we know who the South African man is? Just shout out your thoughts. How will we know? How will we be able to identify the South African man? Black label? He'll be drinking black label beer or he'll be drinking cold beer. Anybody else? He'll be wearing a Springbok jersey, probably eating biltong that he smuggled through Heathrow without anybody knowing about it. He'll roll his R's. I've asked this question about 1,000 times. That's the first time that someone said that, so I'll remember that next time. People say he'll be the one that will stand up when the woman comes in. Possibly. I was at Outsurance recently. Outsurance has all these men on mountain bikes. So I asked the question, and one of the women said, he'll have visible calf muscles. True, that might be true. The story that I used to have about the South African man is that he's going to be the one standing there saying, let me tell you, because they're very certain, these South African men. They have answers. And it's very obvious when we go to the rugby. So when you go to the rugby, the people in the stands know a lot more than Rassie or the guys on the field. I don't know whether you've seen that, but that's my reality. Now I'm married, and I hope I know my husband will forgive me for telling you this part of the story. I'm married to a tall, listen carefully, these are very important distinctions, tall, white, very attractive, rugby playing man from the Dutch Reformed Church. Did I say he played rugby? Rugby playing. Now, we all have a story about what that looks like. They're very certain. They have answers. When the woman has a suggestion, he will tell her what the answer is to that. And then it translates into all sorts of other areas in their lives. When my husband watches tennis, which he has never played in his life, he has never ever played tennis. When Federer or Nadal or Alcaraz come on that screen, he coaches him through the whole game. And gets very irritated when Nadal doesn't do or Alcaraz doesn't do what he tells him to do. So that was my story about South African men. Until I went to the UK, met Mark and Tim, and worked with them for a while, and then got even more confident and more cocky. And I'm embarrassed to tell the story, but it's at the heart of the story about self as instrument. one day I was invited to be in the design session for the BBC Leadership Development Program. I was working for a company called Ashridge Consulting, the design session for the BBC Leadership Program, and I was very confident. People had ideas, my ideas were just a little bit better. Then they had someone else had an idea, then I would build on that idea. Then someone else would say something, and I said, well, in South Africa, you know those people? Horrible to have them in the space. My story was that that's what good leadership looks like. Because leaders should know the way and show the way and give direction. That's the story that I got from when I did my MBA. It's the story that many people today still have, that that's what leadership looked like. They have the way, they know the way, they show the way, they give direction. At the end of the session, one of the women came to me and she tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "Louise, would you mind if I gave you some feedback?" Now, I don't know about you, but that's a very scary moment for me. And the psychologists say or the neuroscientists say, that story is as scary as walking down a dark alleyway with footsteps behind you. So Karen Van Stone, who was this woman who came to me, was very kind in that when I said yes, lying, because I didn't really want to know what she said, but I said yes, she was very kind and she said, "Let's go for a walk." So we went out of the building and went down the path to the forest where there were bluebells out. And I kept looking at the bluebells thinking, if I look at these bluebells long enough, maybe Karen will just disappear. But she was committed. She said, while we were walking and looking at the bluebell, she said something that has changed my life. And it made me realize why leaders have to become interested in how are they experienced by other people. She said, "Louise, I need you to know what happens to me when you are so certain." And it was the first time that I realized that my enthusiasm and passion was experienced as certainty by others. "I need you to know what happens to me when you are so certain. My voice goes completely quiet because there is no space in your certainty for my voice to be heard." And then she continued, "And what I need you to do is to hold certainty a little more lightly so that there's space for my voice too." So that was my first awakening to the fact that when I show up in a room as a leader, I have some choices. I can be the certain one, the one with all the answers. And by doing that, all the other voices are likely to be quiet. We have some politicians, and I won't mention names, but I've spoken to some of the people reporting to this politician, and I said, "Why don't you challenge her?" They said, "Have you tried?" And so leaders really have to be interested in how are we coming across. So the conversation about self as instrument is around leaders taking responsibility for the impact that they have on the people around them. So another story. Recently, I had to get an upgrade done at a Vodacom store within half an hour. Now, anybody in this room, tell me whether you think that's possible. Not just the upgrade, I needed to get a new phone, all of the stuff done, and also a kind of cover on the front of this on the screen so that I could use the phone the next day. Any chance? What do you think the chances are of that actually happening? Never going to happen. Never going to happen. That's exactly how I felt. So I knew that I was trying to do something impossible. Now, in the past, by the time I got to the Vodacom store, I was so irritated about what was going to happen in that store that no one could think in my presence because my irritation levels were high before I even walked into the store. So this particular day, I decided that I was going to take this idea, self as instrument, seriously. So I said, the success of the intervention is dependent on the interior condition of the intervener. The success of the intervention is dependent on the interior condition of the intervener. So this day I decided maybe I'm going to practice what I preach here. So the entire time between leaving home, arriving at the Vodacom store, I calmed myself. I remember thinking I need to breathe. I need to pay attention. How am I going to come across? I need to pay attention to my eyes and my hurriedness and my sense of frustration with Vodacom people. So on this particular day, instead of being irritated and hurried and frustrated, I walked in and I said to the guy, I looked in around the room and I made eye contact with everybody And I was very calm. I said, guys, I have a big challenge. And I wonder whether it's possible for us to achieve this outcome that I have. And one guy said, I'll help. So I walked to him. I said, you didn't know what you're saying yes to, but here's the challenge. I need to be out of here in half an hour, and I need to have an upgrade done and my screen protector on. He said, let's see. 29 minutes later, I left that store, complete everything done that I needed to have done. And I realized that my contribution to what was going on in those Vodacom stores was I was irritated. I did not treat anybody in a way that allowed their brains to work to their fullest extent. So the lesson I've learned from that is that we as leaders have a huge responsibility to uh, pay attention to the only thing that really matters in that room is who am I being? Who am I being, and what is the impact that I have on the people around me? I was working with a group of people recently, and there's one leader who would not take any responsibility for what was going on, constantly blaming and complaining. And then there was a woman. So this was unfortunately the man was blaming other people and shouting and screaming. And the woman was so interested in what is my contribution that's happening here. And what I realized is how attractive it is when people take responsibility for their impact rather than just blame everybody else. So the invitation really is for us to say, what is my contribution and who am I being? And are the people around me able to shine because of who I am? So Musi mentioned the story about the two salesmen who came to South Africa and said, or to Africa and said, they don't have any shoes. What an amazing opportunity. And the other one said, oh, they don't. That came from Ben Zander. And Ben Zander wrote an amazing book called The Art of Possibility. And in that book, he talks about the idea that the conductor is the only musician on the stage who doesn't make a sound. But his power is dependent on his ability to make other people powerful. So what if leaders had to go into the world knowing that my job is to create an environment where everybody in this organization can shine and do their best work? That's a big ask. And how do you know whether you're doing it? Ben says the best key performance indicator to pay attention to is whether people's eyes are shining. If their eyes are shining, we are creating a world where they can make their best contribution. When their eyes are not shining, I get to ask myself, who am I being? Now, that's a tough ask, but to constantly be aware of who am I being. And recently in a workshop, I was talking about it, and one of the guys said, you know, Louise, what you're doing today, you're asking us to be adults. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm asking us, me including, to be an adult. Now, my daughter recently had to ask her boss for something really, she had a big ask. And she told me what her ask was going to be. She's a Gen Z, big demands. And I thought, oh my word, I don't think your boss is going to say yes. But I didn't say anything because I know I have to be careful with telling my kids what to do. So I left it. I said, oh, I'm interesting to know what your boss says. So the next thing she does, she sends me an email. She says to me, I want to send this email to my boss to ask for what I want. And I thought, oh my word, Gen Z, she has a very big ask. She's sending an email to her boss to ask for something really tough. I wonder how that's going to work. So I phoned her. I said, Helen, how important is this for you? She said, it's very, very, very important. I said, and you're going to send an email to your boss to ask this thing that's so important? She stays quiet for a while. She says, I hate it when you're right. I said, what do you mean? She said, Mum, I didn't want to be an adult today. And I think many of us can relate to that. We don't want to be an adult, so we send an email when we have to have a conversation. Or we blame other people when we have contributed to it. So Ben has another story that's been incredibly valuable for me in this. It's the story about the sandwiches. Sandwiches story. But here it is. The two construction workers meet for lunch every day. And this first time they meet, John takes out his sandwich. He looks at the sandwich. He says, "Oh, ham and cheese. Can't stand ham and cheese." And he throws the sandwich in the bin. And his friend goes, "Why would you do that? Perfectly okay sandwich." Next day they meet. John takes out his sandwich. He says, "Egg and cress. Can't stand egg and cress." And he throws it in the bin again. John goes home, or his friend goes home. He says to his wife, "If John does that again tomorrow, I'm going to say something." His wife says, "You must, because it's not okay for people to throw that perfectly okay sandwich in the bin." Next day they meet. He takes out his peanut butter and jam sandwich. He says, "I hate peanut butter and jam on brown bread." And he throws it in the bin again. So his friend says, "John, you really should have a word with your wife about these sandwiches." He says, "You leave my wife out of it. I make my own sandwiches." The reality is we do make our own sandwiches and we create the world that we live in. And so often when I work with leaders, I realize that we don't take that seriously. We have this expectation that, it's happening all around us, but it's not us who's making it happen. So I worked with a group of people who had a very difficult boss. They kept telling me about this very, very difficult boss. And I listened and I listened and I listened. I got really irritated because they just whinge and whine and complain. And I don't know about you, but I can't stand people who whinge and whine and complain. So one day they got, "Louise, you don't get it. The atmosphere is so toxic. The plants are dying." "That must be really hard," I said. So they said, "I think you should come to our meetings. We have a meeting every second Monday from 9 to 1, and we want you to come to the meeting to come and experience how bad things are." So I went and I sat in the meeting, and by about 10 o'clock, I'm ready to slit my wrist. By 11 o'clock, I thought maybe I should just send a note to my friend and she's going to send a note back, or then she can call me and then I can get out of the meeting. Long story short, I stayed there until 1 o'clock. And 1 o'clock, when 1 o'clock came, they turned to me with glee and said, "Did you see how horrible this is?" I said, "It was absolutely awful. You are so right. It was absolutely awful." And they all were very self-assured about the fact that it was so awful. I said, "But I've got there's one observation that I want to make about this meeting, is that your horrible leader was not in the room. You made it happen all by yourself." And so this idea of we make our own sandwiches and we create the world and the reality that we have. Many organizations, Gary Hamel said, many organizations are not fit for human life. And I think it's because of the leaders in those organizations who have a story that leaders must know the way and show the way and give direction, and therefore create a space where very few people are able to make the best contribution that they are destined to make. So my invitation to leaders today is to say, what if we had to start to walk into every space with an expectation to create a space where every person in that room can make the contribution that they are destined to make? Leadership is an act of generosity. It is about stepping away from wanting to be the loudest voice, the one with the answers, the one who's going to tell everybody else what to do, to create a space where everybody in the room can make the contribution because their voice is heard, their contribution is invited. And that requires for us to pay attention to who we're being, but most importantly, what our eyes are communicating. And so I've learned for myself that 25 years ago, when Tim described me as a fiery red, my eyes were quite hard, and it was demanding and it was judgmental. And so the invitation for us is to start to get interested in showing up with soft eyes and giving people an A, because the people we work with know what grade we've given them. They know whether we've given them an F or an A. But every person deserves an A, and the judgment is what gets in the way. Now, Peter Block, who's another one of my mentors, listened to me, and this was also about 25 years ago. But again, I wish everybody had a Peter Block and a Ben Zander and a Mark and Tim in their lives who could help them see, hold up that mirror. I was being very forceful in my advice to people, and I told many people what I thought they should do. And I did it with the kind of story about I'm a problem solver and I have lots to contribute, and so I made my contribution. Peter Block was watching me, and he came up to me afterwards. He said, "Louise, I would love for you to consider the possibility. I wonder whether you're willing to consider the possibility that your being helpful is experienced as a judgment." And so, what I know about Gen Zs is they do not want our answers. They want our interest and our curiosity. Peter said, "What if you were to replace being helpful with being curious?" Now, with my daughters, that's a tough one because, parents want to keep our kids on the straight and narrow. We need to tell them what to do. I'm telling many stories where the result is egg on my face, but I do want to tell you that I have learned from this. But Helen is 27 now. When she was 7, she wrote me a Mother's Day card. And the one thing I hate is spelling mistakes. There were 3 spelling mistakes, so I gave her some feedback because that's what leaders do. They keep people on the straight and narrow. And I'm packing up my house at the moment, and I'm going through all these Mother's Day cards. There are 3 years where I didn't get a Mother's Day card. Because who the heck wants to give a Mother's Day card to a mother who gives feedback about spelling mistakes? And then I realized most of us do this. We get a document where our colleagues have done a lot of work, and they've put a lot of effort in the document. And what do? We go, "Oh, this font on page 3 is really not a good idea. And who said we should use this graph? And what about this?" And why would people then want to do the work for us? So what if we started by acknowledging and appreciating and celebrating the work that went into this, and then came to some agreement around, and how do you want my feedback? Rather than us just giving the feedback without having an agreement around how that feedback is going to come. Now, that means that we have to also, I am aware of that time. I'm going to be done very quickly, very soon. Thank you. That means that we also have to pay attention to our tendency to give advice. Now, most of us in this room, many of us in this room, not most, many of us in this room are either parents or we work with young people. And you know what I've discovered? Is they're very rarely interested in what I think they should do. And I'm seeing lots of heads nodding. And so the question is, well, what do we do? Because we have a contribution to make. We have something to say. And I've learned with my daughters that there's this magic question that I wish I could give everybody to explore. The question is, do you want to know what I think? Most of the time, the answer is no. Then I go to my room and I have a little cry. And about 10 minutes later, she'll come in and say, "Mom, yeah, I do want to know what you think." But now she's asked. I didn't give unsolicited advice. So another tip for leaders is to think about your advice. Your advice is precious. You don't want to just, that story about the sower of the seed and he sowed the seeds on the barren ground and then nothing happened. We can think of our advice as precious. We're not going to sow it on barren ground. We're going to ask people, do you want to know what I think? And only when they do are we going to share it. So I can talk about this forever. My advice, my invitation, my hope for leaders is to realize that our job is to be that conductor, the only person on the stage who doesn't make a sound, the person whose role is dependent on their ability, or their power is dependent on their ability to make other people powerful. So many of you have, I want to end with the quote that many of us have heard, but I promise you, it needed some tough life lessons for me to really take that seriously. And you may have seen this many times. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world, but I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. Now, as an old man, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. And I want to remind you that every person in this room is a massive contribution to the world. I know of some of the people in the room. If you haven't met Sonia Salier, who is the founder of Math Mums, please have a conversation with Sonia at some time. She will blow your mind and the work that they're doing. So here's my hope for you, and it's a poem by Tapiwa Mugawe. Promise me you'll live a remarkable life, one where every day is as intentional as it can be, a life soaked in attentiveness to your whole being. And if you are far from that place, promise you will seek it out. And if you are on your way, promise you will try to reach that place. And if you are there, promise you will live a life so remarkably that others will be inspired to seek it for themselves. Because every life is worth every good thing this place promises.
Floor is open for discussion. Please use the opportunity.
It's always that moment. I'm standing between people and tea. So I get that. If there's no response, we can accept that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yes.
Thank you for the words that you've ended in. I I think at Cornerstone, as a Cornerstone lecturer, we have a hybrid situation where we lecture contact students and we lecture online students. And I often find myself in a difficult position where our online classes are quite big. And then we spend a lot of time marking because we have a lot of students that we need to mark. And then I find myself being frustrated sometimes going, I've spent so much time on making comments on your feedback and you're not reading it and then you're not applying to your next and you get in this like, do feedback? Do I do comments and that? And so today you've challenged me to actually ask my online students, do you want me to just mark your paper or do you want me to mark it and give you feedback rather than just expecting to kind of give feedback? I know as an organization we need to give feedback, but perhaps to just also just ask my online students, who of you actually want feedback from me? It will make them also ask, how do I want to study and what is the reason for me getting feedback? So, yeah, thank you for a reminder that sometimes we have to be curious in ourselves and stir that curiosity in our students as well, as to remember why you are studying this and why you are doing the assignment and do you want the feedback? Because, yeah, and then perhaps that changes them to actually owning up to, yes, I want the feedback, and perhaps changing how they look at their feedback as well. But
That-
thank you very much.
That's beautiful. And I just wanted that kind of speaks to this idea that leadership really happens in partnership. And it's where we have come to an agreement around what are our expectations from each other, rather than assuming that you want to hear what I think, as a mother or as a lecturer. So I have a feeling that will make a big difference. Is to come to an agreement rather than just assume. I often say to my the people I work with that word assume says, if we assume, then I make an ass out of you and me. And the reality is we assume. We make a lot of assumptions. And this next generation, especially the Gen Zs, they want to actually be in a conversation around how will this play out? So I hope that works for you. Thank you. John,
Yeah.
another one of
Thanks.
my mentors.
Yeah. Thanks, Louise. I really enjoyed what you had to say. And I particularly like you making us aware that when we interact with each other, we make judgments about each other. And your words, we give each other a grade. And I can pick up very easily if the way you interact with me, you're giving me A or a F. And in the spirit of Ubuntu, because we are interconnected and um, if I do anything, as I interact with you, whatever I do to you, intentionally or unintentionally, I do to myself. And so if I diminish you in any way, without even being aware that I'm diminishing you, by telling you, I judge you to be an F or a B, but you're not an A. I think for us as human beings to become aware of that is extremely important. So I very much like you today making us aware of particularly our interaction with each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. And for those of you who don't know, John Volmink is one of South Africa's leading lights around Ubuntu, has a real amazing contribution to make around Ubuntu. But specifically, John, with regard to the interaction, I think what we're being asked to do as leaders is to be conscious, of the impact that we have and how we make the people feel around us. So Peter Block says, the delivery vehicle of my expertise is my humanity. And I think we've forgotten that. So we show up wanting to have an impact because I'm a lecturer or I'm a manager or I am the CEO or whatever. But if we make people feel less than, we're going to get a very suboptimal response. But if we make them feel as if they are valued and as if their contribution and their voice and their thinking matters, their contribution is going to look very, very differently. I wanted to give you one more poem that I hope will speak to what I've just said. These poems are so gorgeous. If I can just get there. So I'll leave you with one more poem. This is Bernadette Miller. She said, "What would you do if you realized life was wanting to? What would you say if your words could convey prayers that the world was wanting to pray? What would you be if your being could freeze some piece of the world's unwhispered beauty? What would you stop to bless and caress if you believed that blessing could address our painful illusion of brokenness? What would you harvest from heartache and pain if you understood loss as a way to regain the never forsaken terrain of belonging? What would you love if your love could ignite a sea full of stars on the darkest night? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. It is now tea time, so I think Louise will still be around for a few minutes. So if you do want to corner her and have a little discussion with her, and I do encourage you to, in any case, during the tea time, we've got half an hour, actually a little bit more, to really engage in conversation. Don't just grab yourself something to drink and stand over there in a corner, but ask a person, okay, so you are Marianne Lowe. What do you do? Where are you from? And I assure you that very interesting conversations are going to flow from that. If we can be back in this in the auditorium by 10:25, it would be great so that we just get settled before the next session starts at 10:30. So please enjoy coffee and tea. Our next speaker is Dr. Shirley Lloyd, and she's an old friend of Cornerstone's, a well-known face. Not an old friend, just a long-time friend. Um, and Dr. Shirley Lloyd describes herself as an educator, a public servant, an activist, and a social entrepreneur. And importantly, in our world, in higher education, she was the former director of the NQF Directorate in the Department of Higher Education and Training. So the DET, along with the CHE and so on, are one of the guards that we try to satisfy daily and weekly. So she had a very high role there and knows exactly what education is about in that context. And she's also, Nariman, if Nariman is in the room at the moment, there you are, an expert on recognition of prior learning. Nariman is our person in Cornerstone working on that. So there are several points where, and she has various, you can read in her bio in the booklet, many national and international connections and positions and accomplishments. But I want to hand over to Dr. Shirley. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me back. I appreciate it very much. So, because time is very short, I'm going to go through some of the slides very quickly. I apologize up front, and to get into certain other areas. And yes, I've been around a while, I must say. So, and I've worked across. I think I've been in and worked in and taught or whatever from schooling right through into higher ed and the CETAs and a department. So I've sort of been a bit around the block. That's why I'm very grey. But if I think I'm going to need my glasses. Sorry. You see, age. My husband is very helpful in let me find it. Thank you. Today I'm going to talk on the leadership strategies. And I know there are so many books written about leadership and different concepts about leadership. I think I look at leadership today very much, and I always say I've got the scars to show it, from working in a public space, public government departments, working in a private space, and currently I chair the board of the Association of Private Providers of Education, Training and Development. And there you really get a bloody nose every now and then, because do you know private providers are not even recognized or known. I listened to Professor Jonathan Jansen last night speaking about the minister and what has happened, the ex-minister, and all he referred to were the 26 public universities. So, okay, so I've been around the block, but for me, the experience from that has been the issues. And people say, what should a leader be like? And I've worked with incredible people. But for me, right now, where I find myself is honesty is a huge issue. And I'll tell you why very quickly just now. Credibility and authenticity. So before I get into the slides, you know, the topic I'm speaking on couldn't be more relevant right now, leadership in these approaches, because I serve on the National Skills Authority Board. And our ex-minister last night on the television was talking about the National Skills Authority Board that advised her about the CETA board chairpeople. I was in that meeting. We didn't advise. I've got the minutes to prove it. And I'll tell you what happened. Why is honesty upfront? Integrity, authenticity, credibility. What happened was we were having the induction of the 6th National Skills Authority.